Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Out of the Park Baseball 24 playthrough of the Buffalo Wings. We have made it to the 2038 All-Star break. Our Buffalo Wings are 51-38, second place in the National League East, 2 games behind the Montreal Expos. So it's been a solid first half of the year for the Buffalo Wings, but certainly not spectacular. Appreciate all of the comments to some of the questions I asked and some of the questions that I didn't ask that you still decided to opine on in our last episode, and wanted to cover just a couple of things quickly. Towards the end of the episode, when the all-star teams were announced, I mentioned that I was surprised and disappointed that for a team like ours that has allowed the fewest runs in the National League and one of the top pitching staffs in all of baseball, that the only pitcher we had named to the All-Star team was our stopper, Lorne Walborn, who hasn't pitched a game since May 15th. I thought that was kind of odd. Patrick DeBonis brought up the point that when they're selecting the all-star teams in the game, if you've got a player who's pitched in the last few days who's going to be unavailable for the all-star game, they won't make the team. And I think that probably came back to haunt us. Certainly not going to change what we do just to get more players on the all-star team. But certainly would think that our young closer, Joe Scott, who we picked up in that trade with the Padres this February, who's got 25 saves, a 2.29 ERA, 46 strikeouts, and 39 and a third innings, certainly would have been a good contender. But you can see he's pitched each of the last 2 days. So a bit of a bummer and a bit of a surprise for a team that has a excellent pitching staff to not really have anyone in the All-Star game, since our only All-Star was injured. But it is what it is, and is not the end of the world. And even though our catcher, Andres Medina, was just named to his second consecutive All-Star team, both Jackhammer, Possessor, and Three-Quarters Badger took the opportunity to remind me that they don't like the signing that we made of Medina this past offseason. Certainly, if he's going to be a below-average offensive player, it's going to be very hard to justify his $22 million contract this year, as well as the $18 million that he's going to be due the next 2 to 3 seasons. As great as he is defensively and as great as he is in the clubhouse, if he doesn't get that WRC plus back up towards the 112 level that he was at a year ago, it's hard for me to justify paying him $18 to $22 million a year. Do think with the fact that his contact and his home run power are both a bit above average, and that his eye is still average, he's average or slightly above in the 3 categories that I care about most offensively. Should still continue to knock some homers out of the ballpark, hopefully at a bit higher pace than he's hitting them this year. It was a decision I made, as I said, with his excellent defensive ability, his captain personality, good influence in the clubhouse, and the durability. Very happy to have him as our starting catcher. But if he is a below-average offensive player, even with all those positive things, I can't say that he's worth $18 to $22 million. Maybe a couple versions ago in OOTP, when catcher ability was a well-known hack, you could make that argument, but I don't think in this current version I can say that. So the hope and the expectation is that his offense gets a little better over the second half of the year, but certainly we'll expect to continue being a second guest, or in many cases first guest, on that decision. And if we're going to be talking about me being taken to task for questionable decisions. Sakruth certainly brought up Joe Edwards and his limited playing time this year after he was basically a league average type player a year ago. Backed off on his playing time this year. You can see he's started 40 out of 79 games, so only started about half the time for us. He has been productive this year with a 138 WRC plus, very productive. So we have moved him back into the starting lineup as our starting third baseman against right-handed pitchers, and he remains our starting right fielder against left-handed pitchers. Jim Arp, who we had traded for this offseason and had been starting at second, while Deshaun Safe, who was starting at third, is now on the bench. I tend to have a pretty long leash with players, like to kind of see what the roster I put together does over the first half of the season before I start making big changes in big decisions. Sakruth thinks I should have started getting Edwards at bats more quickly than I did. As I said, the second half of the year we will be getting Edwards those at bats. Arp is now not in the starting lineup anywhere, hitting just a .182 in 214 at bats. Part of the reason I stuck with Arp so long is that Edwards, as we talked about, coming off of a very pedestrian offensive season for us. And at this point, he's due to be making over $11 million next year. So my hope was to perhaps find a combination with Seifu at third and Arp at second that would make me feel okay about potentially trading Edwards this offseason before his even bigger number in arbitration. But I don't think Arp is the answer. So Edwards hopefully will give us a boost in both home runs and our ability to draw walks with more playing time over this second half of the season. And then we'll have to go back to the blackboard this offseason for what this team is going to look like. But I really did want to make Arp work, because if we could have freed up that money that we were going to be paying Edwards next year. You can see right now we've got no money available for extensions, and our salary obligations for 2039 are about $9 million more than this year. If it worked that we could move on from Mr. Edwards, that would potentially give us just about the amount of money that we would need to bring back Lorne Walborn. And even though he's on the IL this year, and he's been on the IL for almost 2 months now, and he's still probably got a month till he'll be rehabbed and ready to go, this is a guy who's been an incredibly valuable reliever for us for each of the last 4 seasons that he's been with us. And as we talked about, still made the All-Star team this year, even though he hasn't pitched since May. So by trying to shoehorn Arp at second and Seifu at third and see if we could potentially move on from Joe Edwards, that was probably the simplest way to give ourselves the optionality to potentially bring back Lorne Walborn. Doesn't mean that we can't bring back both Edwards and Walborn, but it also at this point doesn't mean that we'll bring back either Edwards or Walborn. But felt like potentially moving on from Edwards was one of the simpler ways to potentially free up some cash this offseason. I know some of you are saying, well, if you hadn't signed Medina, you'd have some cash this offseason too. And to that I would say, yeah, I heard you. Stop nagging me. But we have made our bed with Big Baby Medina at this point, so we'll deal with that situation. He's not willing to waive his no-trade clause. As I talked about, I'm very happy to have him as a catcher. Is he earning $22 million right now? Probably not, but he's also not putting up $5 million of value either. So some thoughts on Edwards and Medina and the All-Star team from viewers that just wanted to share a little bit deeper thoughts. And I've shared some of the thoughts that I just shared in the comments section to the last episode, but I can't imagine everyone has read that. And the thing that I finished off the last episode with was the question regarding whether we should potentially make a trade for one of the more interesting hitters in baseball, Max Clark, who could certainly also help our offense, and asked for some thoughts on that from the viewers, and appreciate those who shared their opinions. Max Clark clearly has a very positive offensive profile, clearly has a very positive defensive profile, reasonably proficient on the base paths. The negatives associated with Max Clark are he's closing in on 34 years old. He's making a ton of money. And perhaps most importantly, he's wrecked physically. So Three Quarters Badger suggested that he would not make a trade for Max Clark. Very worried about the proclivity of Mr. Clark towards picking up injuries, and that is definitely my big concern with Max Clark also. This is a guy who's got a 118 OPS plus and 110 WRC plus this year, both figures that are well off his career averages, but I'm going to attribute that to just a little bit of bad luck and the small sample size of just 128 at-bats that he has. When we take a look at the scouting on Max Clark, 65 contact, 60 power, and 60 eye. And you can see that, for most of his career, that's kind of what he's been. If we look back 2031, 7 years ago, he was 70 contact, 60 power, 60 eye. So his defense is a little worse, his contact is a little worse, but his power and his eye are still what they've basically always been. So I tend to think we'll get good offensive production from Mr. Clark if we bring him on. The question is just whether we'll be able to keep him healthy. Certainly would love if we added him, if he could help us win a 7th consecutive NL East title and secure a first-round bye in the playoffs rather than having to play in a wild card series. That would be a big part of having him on board. But the most important reason to have him on board is to hopefully have him healthy and well and in the lineup every day in the playoffs. And there's no guarantees that will happen. So that's what makes me cautious. Three Quarters Badger brought up that he's very concerned about that. Stanley Rosella and Jackhammer Possessor were both more inclined to roll the dice and bring Max Clark on board. And I think that's the direction that I am leaning right now. Jackhammer Possessor also brought up the point that two of the guys who were potentially going to be able to get Mr. Clark for us are two of the better pitching prospects in our system. I don't want to say that they are ace pitching prospects, but because they certainly are not. But guys who we think could be effective fifth starters, and he suggested, or I guess I'm assuming that Jackhammer Possessor is a he, but I'm not really accurate or completely knowledgeable about that. But Jackhammer Possessor suggested perhaps just shopping those two players to see if perhaps there's someone even more interesting than Clark that we could get for them. And that was an excellent suggestion. Honestly, Clark is about the best thing that we can get for them. So I think that I'm going to go ahead and think about making a trade for Clark. But the suggestion from Jackhammer Possessor did get me thinking about potentially using both of those players to bring assets back on board that could perhaps help us a bit more. We did make an offer to Pittsburgh for one of the pitchers, Jeremy Barr. Like the fact that he's a lefty, like the fact that he's durable, like the fact that he throws in the mid to high 90s, like the fact that he's got some positive personality traits. He's 5-2 with a 3.39 ERA this year as a 23-year-old in Double-A. When I look at this profile, though, he's a borderline starter because that third pitch, that changeup is below average, and we don't think it's going to get much better. So he's a guy who we could use as a spot starter if we needed, but really he's a nice, solid arm out of the pen. But I think we've got enough guys like that in the system, particularly with the fact that we pushed the envelope here and asked Pittsburgh to retain 70% of Clark's salary, and they were willing to do that. I'm going to roll the dice and bring Clark on board. If Clark stays healthy, my expectation is this is a guy who should certainly put up a 125 WRC plus for us over this rest of the year. He'll also play a really nice defensive outfield, likely center field for us. And if he's healthy, I think he's a guy who could really help give us a boost in our offense that we're also hoping to get from Joe Edwards to get our offense closer to our pitching staff. Our pitching staff, as we talked about, is the best in the league right now. Our offense is good, fourth in runs scored, but as I said, home runs and walks were not very good, and getting Edwards into the starting lineup every day will help with that, and I think getting Clark onto our team will certainly help with that. It's a 1-year rental, or it's quite honestly a 2.5-month rental. I'm going to probably only play Clark against right-handed pitching, and I'm also going to set him up so that if we're playing a bunch of right-handed pitchers in a row and his stamina starts to go down a bit, we're going to put him right on the bench to try to keep him healthy. But I think that although Jeremy Barr is certainly a guy who has some value, I don't feel like his ceiling is incredibly high. I feel like his floor for a guy in Double-A is pretty high. It's hard to not see him as a useful left-handed arm in the majors, but it's hard for me to see him as much more than just a useful left-handed arm in the majors. So we are going to go ahead and we are going to complete that trade. If Clark ends up injured, certainly maybe regretting it, but I do think that Max Clark is the type of bat who could certainly be pivotal in us winning a game in October. And given that our goal is to win it all this year, bringing on a guy who can help us win games in October, if he's healthy, is a move that I'm willing to make. And to make room for Mr. Clark on the roster, we actually sent ARP down to AAA. He still has one option year left. He didn't refuse the assignment. We're going to start him at third base, try to perhaps play him a little bit in right field and left field as well. He's 6 foot tall, so we could even play him at first base a bit. Try to make him as versatile defensively as possible, get him a little more seasoning down in the minors. Don't think he is our answer as a full-time second baseman, but still could have a future for us as a useful utility infielder. So we'll try to play ARP every day in Albany while, since he wasn't going to be in the starting lineup against lefties or righties at the major with the changes that we've just made to our lineup. And we are going to put Max Clark right into our lineup as our cleanup hitter and our starting center fielder against right-handed pitching. As I mentioned, I'm not going to play him against left-handed pitching. And we've also set up so that if his fatigue gets to 93%, or more accurately below 93%, that we're going to rest him. So going to try to be as conservative with his playing time as possible to keep him healthy. Bringing him on board did take Tim Gaglia out of the starting lineup as our center fielder against right-handed pitching. Gaglia is still in the lineup against left-handed pitching. He was having a bit of a disappointing year, below average offensively after being slightly above average offensively each of the previous 2 seasons. As much as I appreciate Gaglia's speed and his slightly better range than Clark, his bat certainly is not the same. He should be getting a decent amount of playing time still as our center fielder against left-handed pitching, and then as our primary backup for whenever Clark needs a day off. But I think it would be hard to argue that we should have Tim Gaglia in the starting lineup against right-handed pitching over a guy like Max Clark. And with the trade that we made and the money that we're going to be on the hook for Clark, that cost us about half of the total money that we have available. So we still have the opportunity to do a little bit more here as we approach the trade deadline, which is less than 3 weeks away at this point. But certainly would expect that the addition of Max Clark is going to be our big, bold move in the trade market. And hopefully the move of Edwards into the starting lineup and Arp out of the starting lineup and ultimately down to AAA Albany will be another move that will help improve our offense over the second half of the season. And as I mentioned, Jackhammer Possessor suggested that we look at what we could potentially get in return, not just for Jeremy Barr, who we ended up trading away for Mr. Clark, but also for Johnny Pop, who's the other pitcher that we were considering trading. And Pop is a guy who we picked in the 7th round. Looking at this profile, I think he's got a decent chance of being a 5th starter, possibly could be a 4th starter. I don't think he's ever going to be an ace. The issue is he's coming off of a torn rotator cuff right now, so he's going to miss the rest of this year. Was 6-3 with a 5.54 ERA and A ball for us this year. Probably would have promoted him to high A by now if he had been healthy, just by virtue of the fact that he was better a year ago in part of a season in A ball. But he's going to be 22 years old when he's coming back from this injury. And as I said, his ceiling to me is a 4th starter. His most likely role is a 5th starter. So as a right-handed 4th or 5th starter, I don't see him as being an incredibly valuable commodity. And I am intrigued by one of the players that we could pick up for him, and that's Mitch Houlihan, who would be our backup catcher. Now, I don't love that Houlihan is fragile. I do like that he's another left-handed bat. Looking at his profile, he's pretty good at making contact. Not going to walk much, doesn't have a bunch of home run power, but he is another very good defensive catcher with a nice arm. And when I look at what he's done in the majors, it's a very small sample size, but 401 at-bats now over 3 seasons, and he's hit over 300 every season he's been in the majors. Now this profile, 60 contact, 50 gap power, 35 home run power, 40 I, and 75 avoiding strikeouts, does not suggest to me a 300 hitter, especially given the lack of speed that he has, but he has been a reasonably proficient hitter at the major league level, and he's got good catcher ability. He's been up for over 2 years now, but he still should be making the major league minimum next year. And he's a guy who's got 3 option years left. So even if we end up in a situation where we do end up promoting next year to the majors Jorge Berrios, we could still, over the next couple of seasons, between Berrios, who's got 1 option year left, and potentially bringing on board Houlihan with 3 option years left, we could get through the 2039 and 2040 seasons with some combination of those two backing up Medina. And then if Medina were to opt out, I don't think a Houlihan Berrios platonic catcher would be all that bad, given that they're both above average offensive players. So do I think Houlihan is a great player? No. but a backup catcher who's hit 300 and 400 at bats in the majors, who's very good defensively, is an interesting potential asset for us, particularly given that when I went through our review of our team in the previous episode, Ted Jackson, who's been our backup catcher this year and also happens to be fragile, has hit a buck 55 this year, and he's not nearly as good defensively as Houlihan is. So in an effort to upgrade a third position, we upgraded third base with the shift to Edwards, we hope. We upgraded center field with the addition of Clark, and now we potentially upgrade catcher by moving on from Mr. Jackson. A fourth or fifth starter is, in almost all situations, going to be worth more than a backup catcher. I can't argue against that. But a fourth or fifth starter who's going to be 22 years old, likely pitching in high A ball or maybe double A next year, coming off a torn rotator cuff, I just don't think that the ceiling on Pop is incredibly high, whereas Houlihan can help us win games this year. He's going to be under our team control for 4.5 seasons if we pick him up right now. He's a guy who still has minor league options if we want to send him down, and he is very good defensively. I know that some of you aren't going to like this trade, but although I'm going to try to get a little bit more cash out of them, I think I'm going to go ahead and ship away Mr. Pop as well. So both of the guys who we kind of thought were fourth or fifth starters that we might be dealing for Clark are going to end up being dealt away. And actually, although it said that they would trade Houlihan for us back at this screen, as we know from the latest version of the game, that doesn't always mean that a deal can actually be done. So we can't complete it immediately, but we can at least submit the offer. Pop for Houlihan. And if that trade ultimately goes through, as I said, we'll be in a situation where we'll be upgrading at backup catcher as well. So at this point, I think we'll start simming ahead through the All-Star game, wait to hear what happens as far as that Houlihan for Pop trade. I think if they're looking for more than straight up, we'd probably be inclined to say no. I think, as I said, it's somewhat marginal right now. If Pop fully develops and he ends up being a fourth starter, I think he's definitely more valuable than a backup catcher. But as I said, I do think Houlihan is a potentially really good backup catcher, particularly if he keeps hitting anywhere near 300, and there's no guarantees that Pop will actually become a fourth starter, given his profile coming off of that pretty significant injury. He could end up being a just kind of generic right-handed arm out of the bullpen when all is said and done. And it does look like Pittsburgh is looking for more than just Pop for Houlihan. In some cases, there's some pretty big-time prospects in our system, but also some guys that are less interesting. We'd throw in the 25-year-old minor league reliever Jim Miller. Was a 17th round pick of ours out of Northwestern 4 years ago. He's never made it above A ball for us, although he's probably worthy of a promotion to high A or double A with the way he's pitching in A ball this year, but not a big time prospect. The principle of adding in another player in addition to Pop to pick up Houlihan still bothers me a bit, even though I think Houlihan would be a nice upgrade for us this year. Certainly moving on from Barr and potentially Pop in relatively short order weakens the pitching in our farm system. and our farm system is right in the middle of the pack at this point, ranked 16th out of 32nd overall. We've got Barbarito, who is, I think, better than a number 5 starter, who's 12-5 with a 3.39 ERA in Albany. Basically, he'll be up very soon. But then when you look at some of the other top pitching prospects in our system, Devin Cabuto, who was a first-round pick in 2035, 7-5 with a 4.30 ERA in high A ball this year, an insane 150 strikeouts in 104 and 2/3 innings, but an almost as insane 71 walks allowed in those 104 and 2/3 innings. But he's a guy whose profile, to me, is better than Barr or Pops. Jim Lance is a guy who was a second-round pick in 2036, still in rookie ball and has not distinguished himself there. But the top end of that profile, if his slider ends up developing, to me is still better than Barr or Pop. You can see Pop listed as our 159th best prospect. But then we also have Josh Nagy, who was our first-round pick in 2036. He's been struggling in rookie ball thus far. A little concerned about his control, but top end, I think if he fully develops, he's more interesting than those guys. And then even Eric Fisher, who we picked in the second round this year, very early in his career, but another guy who, if he fully develops, I think is better than Barr or Pop. So with the exception of Barbarito, I don't know that we've got anyone who's better than a third or fourth starter among that crew. And even Barbarito, to say he's much more than a third starter is probably a bit of a stretch. But I do feel with the pitching that we've got at the major league level now, with Barajas, Shazier, and Estrada still all signed for a few years, Mendoza not even arbitration eligible yet, and Barbarito likely taking over for Ochoa at some point, either next year or maybe later this year. The opportunity for Barr or Pop to ever play a significant role in our rotation with the guys that we've got right now and the other guys that we have on the way is, in my mind, pretty low probability. So I think it's fair to say that we're probably overpaying for a backup catcher, but I love me a backup catcher who's really good defensively, bats left-handed, which is a little bit different, and as I said, is a guy who's hit over 300 every opportunity he's had in the majors. Again, I agree, looking at this batting profile, it doesn't scream out to me this guy's a 300 hitter, but I have to take into account what he's done over 400 at-bats at the major league level. And with that glove, even if he's just a 250 hitter as a backup catcher, with that glove, I think there's some value there. And his performance on the field suggests to me that he could be better than a 250 hitter at the major league level. So we are going to go ahead, add Jim Miller into this trade, and we're just going to get this deal done. I'm not going to mess around anymore. Pittsburgh doesn't have any money to add. I could try to get a crappy prospect in addition, but I'm just going to get the deal done, bring Houlihan on board. That will put us in a position where Mr. Ted Jackson can now be demoted back down to Albany. Mr. Houlihan will take over as our backup catcher, and I feel like in the last couple of days of game time, as I said, we've upgraded our backup catcher, we've upgraded at third base, and we've upgraded at center field with the moves that we've made. So feel like we've taken some hopefully important steps to improving this offense that's, as I said, fourth in the National League, but I think it could be better, and we certainly could use a little more pop in the lineup, and particularly getting Edwards more at-bats and getting Clark into the lineup are two things that could result in us hitting some more home runs in the second half of the year than we have hit in the first half of this season. And with those moves in the books, I tend to think that's probably going to be the majority of our activity, or most likely all of our activity for this trade deadline. But still going to kind of see how things go over the next couple of weeks, see if there's anyone real interesting who comes up available in trade. Always tend to add a reliever or two as we approach the trade deadline. This could be a different year. As we've talked about, Walborn is about 3 weeks away. And in AAA right now, with Eric Barbarito in particular down there, I feel like we've got two really good arms who are probably better than some of the guys who are in our pitching staff right now. And our pitching staff is already the best in baseball. So this may be a year where we're a little less greedy and ambitious in terms of the pitchers we add as the trade deadline approaches. And we've been playing very well coming out of the All-Star break with those changes that we've made. We took 3 out of 4 at Pittsburgh. Then we took 2 out of 3 home against Atlanta. And we just swept a 3-game series in Nashville. So we've got a road trip to Baltimore and then 2 games home against the Dodgers before we officially hit the trade deadline. Taking a look at the standings, we've closed the gap on the Expos to just 1 game now. With that 596 winning percentage, there still are the Expos, the Rockies, the Twins, the Guardians, and the Yankees all ahead of us in terms of their winning percentage on this year. So although we're only a game out of the division, we've got a lot of teams that we would need to potentially pass to end up with the best record in baseball. But quite honestly, other than the Yankees, all of those teams are certainly within sight, just a couple games ahead of us. And even the Yankees at 64-35, 5 games ahead of us for the best record in baseball, which is certainly not an insurmountable amount for us to overcome over the last 2+ months of the season. Not feeling like there's a ton we need to do with the moves that we've made. Got a couple guys banged up. Tim Gaglia, mild shoulder strain, a little impact on his throwing. Tegan Tiley, a hyperextended ankle. Those guys are both only in the lineups regularly against left-handed pitching. So neither one of those is a huge issue. Clearly, if there was some significant injury issues over the next few days, that could increase the likelihood of us doing something dramatic. Our old buddy Dylan Carlson, still available as a free agent after that very disappointing year he had for us a year ago. Taking a quick look at the trading block, a few guys still out there. We don't need to do a catcher now with the move that we've made. Jeremy Williams, good defensively, like the home run pop, but making a lot of money. And Nashville was looking for a lot for him, so feel that the move we made to bring on Houlihan probably made more sense. Couple of second basemen with some pop out there. Shamar Badio, kind of a negative influence in the clubhouse, and the Cubs have been looking for a lot for him. And I believe, he's also got multiple years left, so that's not really the kind of deal that we want to make, despite the fact that he's pretty good. Emmanuel Lantigua, pretty decent defensive second baseman. He's actually also a guy who has the potential to be a two-way player, which is borderline interesting. Has not been particularly effective as a reliever in the majors. And when we look at his ratings, I think he'd have a tough time making our pitching staff. Certainly if he's a two-way guy that we're more interested in as a utility infielder, he could have some additional value as a reliever. But given that he only plays second base, we're probably not going to teach him how to play other positions at the major league level. Also has some negative personality traits, so I don't see that being a route that we would pursue incredibly hard. Drew Jones defensively was interesting at center field, but he's also wrecked and he doesn't have nearly the bat that Clark does. So happy to have Clark on board instead of him. Taking a look at the pitchers who are available, there's a lot of good relievers, some familiar names, including Cameron Johnson, who was on our team this time of year just a couple seasons ago. If we could get the left-handed Cameron Johnson for very little, that would be something to consider. There are, lower end prospects that we could give up for him straight up, but still generally starting pitchers. I think Cameron Johnson is really good, but he was not particularly effective the couple months that we had him in Buffalo. He's not been particularly effective this year. And as I talked about, I just don't feel like our pitching staff needs a ton of help right now. As I said, with Walborn a week or so away from beginning a rehab assignment, and Barbarito, who's certainly ready for the majors at this point, down in the minors, and 13 guys on our major league pitching staff at this point. Obviously, if we lose an Alexis Barajas, our ace, that's going to be a huge loss for us, especially come playoff time. But feel like the incremental benefit, even from being in a big-time reliever, is not going to be all that significant, because you look at our relievers and most of them have ERAs in the 1s and 2s. Juan Reynoso is a guy who we wouldn't mind moving on from to open up a spot on the major league team for Barbarito. Maybe we look to shop Reynoso, but I just don't think we're going to get that much for him at this point. Might as well shop and see what's available, but I don't think we're going to be particularly intrigued by what Mr. Reynoso will bring back. It does look like there might be some useful-ish players out there. I'll pour through this list, because if we did move on from Reynoso, that could make it a little more likely that we go after a big-time reliever. I mean, Persinger was one of the guys who was listed as one of the better relievers out there. He could help us a little bit this year. He's making a lot of money, headed to free agency. He's certainly an upgrade over Reynoso, so from that perspective, maybe it makes sense. But in a perfect world, if I'm going to trade away Reynoso, I'd almost rather get somebody who's a younger prospect with some value for the future, knowing that we're going to need that spot, that roster spot that Reynoso's holding right now, for somebody like Walborn in the not-so-distant future. And as much as I was just talking about my concern about how Cameron Johnson performed for us when he was with us a couple years ago and not really needing him, we can get him for Juan Reynoso, who is making $2.1 million. He's going to be a free agent after this year as well. He's been very ineffective in the just over a year that he's been on our team at this point. 8.76 ERA a year ago, 6.47 ERA this year. As much as I'd love to use that roster spot to open up a spot for Barbarito or Walborn, the fact that I can get an upgrade with Cameron Johnson, with another guy who's going to be a free agent at the end of this year, seems to me as a pretty obvious trade to make, to try to bolster our bullpen a bit. Johnson is not going to be a closer for us. He's not going to be in the starting rotation, although he is a guy who could be a borderline starter if we needed him to, which helps a little bit. But he is basically just going to be in the bullpen to hopefully get some left-handers out in some clutch situations. And as I said, be a big upgrade, hopefully performance-wise. Even if he throws to the 4.50 ERA that he had with us a couple years ago, and I think he should be better than that, that's still a pretty significant upgrade and improvement to what Reynoso's done for us over the past year. They're both going to be free agents after this year, anyways. I think it's pretty unlikely we would bring either back. So we're going to go ahead and complete the trade to bring Cameron Johnson on board. The fans a little upset about Reynoso leaving, but the fans are very excited that Cameron Johnson is on board. So net, that should be slightly positive for attendance as well. And not a huge trade, and again, not one that we really needed to make given how good our bullpen is. Use a little bit more of the money we have available and upgrade the back end of our bullpen as we close into the final few days before the trade deadline here in 2038. And that ended up being all we did as the trade deadline approached. We've looked at some other options, nothing particularly interesting to talk about, so we have made it past the trade deadline to August 1st. Record is 64-50. We have won 8 in a row. Unfortunately for us, the Expos have also won a lot, 5 in a row, and like us, they are 9-1 in their last 10. So we're still a game behind in the division, but at this point, only the Expos and the Yankees have better records than us, and both of those teams are only 1 game better than us. So we talked about the fact that even though the Yankees were 5 games ahead of us just a little bit over a week ago, that was certainly a number that we felt that we could overcome if everything went well. And here, as we begin the month of August and the push for the playoffs over the last 2 months of the season, a 7th consecutive division title, the best record in the National League, and potentially the best record in baseball are all well within our grasp. As you can see, we're up 11 and a half games now on the final wild card spot in the National League, so should be in a pretty good position to get this team back to the playoffs for an 11th year in a row. Quick look at the stats. Deshaun Seifu, once again, looks like he will lead the National League in steals for an 11th consecutive season. And Joe Scott, who we talked about as a guy that we thought perhaps should have been an all-star, is now second in the National League with 33 saves. So things going pretty well for our Buffalo Wings. Taking a look at the team statistics, just hit a 19-7 record in July. So the nice thing about this team is we've gotten better every month of the season. Certainly going to be difficult to continue playing 7:30 baseball and a higher level than that in August and then September. But at 64-40, as we talked about, we're 1 game out of first, right in line with Pythagorean expectations. Still 4th in the National League in runs scored, still 1st in the National League in runs allowed, and you can see we are in the top handful of every pitching category in the National League, with the exception of strikeouts, where we rank 7th. So things are going well. We'll take a very quick look at our new additions. Cameron Johnson only pitched 1 game for us, struck out 2 in an inning and a third of action. Mitch Houlihan, the new catcher, he had hit 300 every other stop in his major league career. He's hitting .571 for us, admittedly a tiny sample size with 7 at-bats, but 4 hits and 7 at-bats with a couple of walks results in an unworldly 1.238 OPS. So he's off to a nice start with us. Joe Edwards getting some more regular playing time. His OPS plus stands at 147 right now. And last but not least, Mr. Max Clark, and he has not gotten off to a great start with us. Small sample size, 46 at-bats, does have 3 doubles and a homer and has driven in 7 runs. That said, he struck out 12 times, hitting just a .174, well below average offensively, and he's been so bad offensively that he's actually been below replacement level. But he's not hurt, which is positive, and I tend to think based on his ratings profile and what he has done at the major league level over the course of a very long and established career of over a decade at this point, that we're just getting a bit unlucky with him. And that 206 BABIP is something that I would expect would hopefully improve by at least 100, 115, 120 points in the coming weeks and months. So Clark, not off to a great start for those of you who didn't want us to pick him up, but I am still going to attribute that to a small sample size at this point. So in our next episode, we'll find out what this team can achieve over the last couple months of the season as we try to get back in the playoffs and hopefully have a team that is healthy and well suited to try to compete for a World Series championship come October. Until our next episode, thanks so much for watching and hope you have a great day.